Today is February the 14th, Valentine's Day, and I know I'm very happy to see you all here today on this day that is associated with love and romance. And usually you do not associate those concepts with Iraq these days. But in fact, there is a connection, because one concept that I will be talking about or referring to is Hub al-Watan, or which means love of the nation, or nationalism, or patriotism. About 5 years ago, or 4 years ago, when I was recently moved here to Williamstown, I got a phone call in September from a man named Anthony who was living in Norfolk, Connecticut. He asked me if I could come down to see his brother's library. His brother had just passed away. It so happened that his brother was Hana Batatu. Hana Batatu was a great scholar of Iraq, who was a professor at Georgetown University, who has written the book on Iraqi history, the Bible for Iraqi scholars, about 1,200 pages, single-spaced type. Hana Batatu had just passed away, and he asked me if I could come down and assess the library and if I wanted to purchase the library. So I drove down to Connecticut and met him and assessed the library, and he told me that Professor Batatu was a very sort of man with regular habits. And one night he came up for dinner, and then after the dinner he went down with his niece to the basement and they watched the TV show Jeopardy. And they were watching the TV show Jeopardy, and his niece was there with him, and the question came, and Hana Batatu says very excitedly, "What is Iraq?" Which was, of course, the answer to the question. Now his niece goes upstairs and minds her own business, and about 2 hours later they return, only to discover that Hana Batatu had passed away in his chair. And so it was very symbolic that this great scholar of Iraq, who has written the book, his final word should be, "What is Iraq?" And if Hana Batatu doesn't know the answer to that question, how are we supposed to know? This is, however, an important question. It is in some ways the $2 trillion question. Economists Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, and Linda Bilmes of Harvard have estimated that when all is said and done, the war effort in Iraq will cost about $2 trillion, not with million with an M or billion with a B, but trillion with a T. $2 trillion. So that's approximately $200 million a day, or about $8 million an hour. So by the time this talk is over, another $8 million will have gone to this war effort. So this is obviously a question. If the war is taking place in Iraq, and this Iraq project will cost about $2 trillion, it's obviously very important that we maybe consider what Iraq is. And one of the questions that should be asked and is being asked is, to what extent is Iraq viable? Is it a viable state? What is this $2 trillion being dropped into? Should it be preserved? Is it in fact an artificial nation that has absolutely no basis in reality? Should we try to prop it up? Is it a patient that needs some sort of medicine, or does it need surgery? Should we in fact split it up, partition it into 1 or 2 or 3 countries? And if we do partition it, what should form the basis of that partition? In this debate, in this very important political debate that is now somewhat central in the presidential campaign taking place, there are several options being explored, including the surge, and then the withdrawal, various types of withdrawals, immediate or timed or with timelines. Then there was a resolution, a non-binding resolution passed in Congress by Joseph Biden, who some people say might be a vice presidential candidate. He was a presidential candidate up until very recently. A Biden plan that talks about some sort of federalist system in which the Iraqis would be encouraged to follow that model. And then there's, it's actually a very relatively good plan, the Biden plan, though it has very many problems as well. And then there's another sort of a very popular idea that makes, at first glance, perfect sense, or there's something sort of rational about it, that to split Iraq into 3 countries. Obviously, it's a mess, it's chaos, it's chaotic, it's anarchy, And since we're trying to keep it together, Why even bother? Why not just split it up into three and have a Sunni state, a Shia state, and then a Kurdish state? I want to sort of consider those discussions, that discussions in the context of Iraqi history and the way that Iraq has been defined the last 80 years or so. And I use sort of the bookends of my talk, of my timeline, is 1921, sort of the formal establishment of modern Iraq, and today. It starts as an imperial project in many ways, and it still today is an imperial project in a certain way. And then there's that interesting time period in between, but it's the beginning and the end that I'll be sort of form the bookends, and the assumptions that have gone into Iraq, and the assumptions that we make when we are discussing Iraq, and especially the questions that we might have about Iraq. Sort of generally speaking, and sort of generalizing, people have tended to question whether Iraq is in fact worth it as a nation. People have a very essentialist notions of identity, and sort of assume that there cannot be any kind of homogeneity because of the extensive diversity of Iraq. So today I want to make a point. It is basically a very simple point. In today's context, in our environment today, it's a profoundly political point, but I'm making a historical point. A point that is based on Iraq's history and Iraq's experience with their own history, and the fact that there are Iraqis and they live in Iraq and have experienced Iraq. And that basic point is that there is such a thing as Iraq. Iraq is not an artificial entity. It is not an artificial nation. That does not mean it's not a complicated place. Definitions of Iraq have changed constantly. It is a progressive, multifaceted, dynamic notions. Throughout the last 80 years, and this is what makes this as an exciting field, Iraqis have created narratives of affiliation and belonging from a multiplicity of local, national, and transnational sources. Now, for some of you, this might seem like basic stuff, but this is still important in today's context just to remind ourselves that identities are not fixed and they are not ahistorical. In Iraq in particular, and perhaps elsewhere, identity is multifaceted, subject to time and place, that's very important, interactive and relationship, and they're rarely unidimensional, but incorporate social, cultural, and material configurations that give national identities their particularism and their specificity. In this respect, Iraqi identity emerges from a very distinct geographic cultural space. This is self-evident, but we should still be reminded of that. And it further develops as a result of the influence of external as well as internal factors, expands because of local struggles over meaning and purpose, and since it is a dynamic category that reflects social, cultural, political, and economic conditions in Iraq across time, it is continually reinventing itself under the impact of change. In fact, Iraqi nationalism has strengthened, not decreased in the last 5 years, in no small part because of the all-out assault on Iraqi identity from both the US political and military establishment, but also of the local insurgency and other forces in the region. In Iraq, the political and social processes, in plural, was fundamentally affected and shaped by external powers, Britain and then France and then the United States, Russia, and others. Nevertheless, it cannot be claimed that the state structures which were established in Iraq were either totally artificial or entirely lacking in indigenous underpinning. On the other hand, they did not evolve naturally or out of some clear indigenous processes of conflict or out of free competition between internal, social, and political forces. Initially and today, this has been micromanaged. Obviously, socio-economic existing conditions and the fact of a common Islamic and Ottoman past cannot be ignored, but in the final analysis, the condition in which the Iraqi state was formed and institutionalized in the aftermath of the First World War has had a crucial effect on the evolution of politics of Iraqi society. So it is a contested notion. It is something that is unfinished business. It is not entirely clear how you create a unified platform because of the multi-religious, confessional, linguistic, tribal identities, because of the various class divisions, because of the difference between the metropole and the peripheries, between the margins. But generally speaking, just for the last 700 years, generally speaking, in Iraq, in what is now called Iraq, people have not sort of striven to identify themselves based on their sect or their confession or their religion. Rather, people in their intercommunal relationships have tried to diminish that, de-emphasize that, under the umbrella of some sort of greater idea, whether it's the Ottoman Empire or the Iraqi nation. So the importance of a region and not the importance of sectarian identity. So I mentioned before the external powers, the role of the British and later the United States, and the importance of internal developments. So we can maybe view this as a dialectic between the two, the Iraqi identity, sort of mutually feeding off each other. In some ways, and this is sort of my thesis, my theory, that Iraq has a positive identity in the sense that Iraqis do not identify themselves negatively, namely, we are who we are by who we are not. That's an example of a negative identity because of the diversity within the country, but rather it has been a positive identity. We are who we are by who we are and what we have gone through. So let's look at the external factors. Back to 1917. In 1914, the British invaded what is now Iraq. It was then called Mesopotamia in the British circles, the land between the two rivers. This was part of World War I. The Ottoman Empire was governing in this area. And as part of the British war effort, in order to get back at the Ottoman Empire, the back door, they attack Mesopotamia at Basra, and they expected a swift and decisive victory. They were surprised, however, to find that the local peoples and the Turkish military put up a full assault against them. And it took them about 3 years to get to Baghdad. And here you have a picture of General Maude, the British general, entering Baghdad in 1917 after 3 years of hard-fought battles. When he entered Baghdad, he issued a declaration which is famous, very famous, in which, to the Iraqi people at least, where he says, the British army is not entering your cities as conquerors, but as liberators. Your lands have been subject to Turkish tyranny. Remember, they were part of the Ottoman Empire. And your wealth has been stripped from you by unjust men, i.e. the Turk. It is not the wish of the British government to impose upon you alien institutions. Maude's declarations is almost plagiarized from Napoleon, who, when he invaded Egypt in 1798, he said when he was convincing the Egyptians, who were then governed by the Mamluks, who were under the rubric of the Ottoman Empire, that they too had came as liberators and they were not there to destroy the religion of the country. And just sort of as a side, in 2003, March 2003, and in April, Donald Rumsfeld, then the Secretary of Defense, said, we are entering as liberators. And then this final point, this is not a war against a people. It is not a war against a country, and certainly not against a religion. It is a war against a regime. So we come here, we're nothing against you, the people, but it's the regime. Let's go back to Maude, General Maude. This was, of course, part of the First World War I effort, part of the British way to win the war, at that time, very part of their overall wartime strategy. And since they had conquered Iraq militarily, then for them, from their perspective, and from the superpower perspectives of the time, Iraq was basically war booty. It was a prize, something that the British could then naturally control. So they started thinking about how can then Iraq fit into our larger worldview, our larger imperial network, our possessions in Asia and Africa, where will this all fit? So as far as the British were concerned, they had this area which they could then carve out for themselves to serve clearly British geopolitical interest. There was nothing sort of, they were not shy about that. They were not in a closet about that. They were there openly declaring these intentions. Interestingly, before Maude issued the declaration in 1917, in the context of the war, the British and the French had made some secret arrangements about the Middle East in which they decided to split up the region into French spheres and British spheres, and then sort of where they had zones of influence. If you look at this map carefully here, then the red zone right here was supposed to be under direct British control. So basically just briefly north of Baghdad and then down towards the Persian Gulf. Then this area here was supposed to be under British influence. So this light blue area here where it's Mosul and what is now northern Iraq was supposed to be under French influence. So originally when the British went in 1916, they were not thinking that in the future there would be something that would look what we now know as Iraq. But they came in there stressing with Gertrude Bell, Arnold Wilson, Percy Cox, these British imperialists, that they were going to establish something there that would serve their interests, but also to justify to the Iraqi people that they would give them, allow them to enjoy the benefits of liberty and justice. General Maude and, of course, Gertrude Bell. They started this Iraqi project. I just want to show you a quick photograph. This is Maude. He died in 1919, and this is his tomb in northern Baghdad. And Gertrude Bell is also buried in Baghdad. This is her tomb, which was actually cleaned up in the war by Tamara Chalabi, the daughter of Ahmed Chalabi. This was her private project to clean up his tomb. So they started the imperial project of giving liberty and freedom to the Iraqi people. There was, however, one problem. The Iraqis were not quite sure about the benefits of British freedom and British liberty. In 1920, in the hot summer of 1920, what started as a relatively minor incident, somebody didn't pay a bill and was imprisoned, and his fellow tribesmen revolted. And slowly but surely, this turned into a large-scale insurrection throughout the country. It started, if you look here in the map, the sort of the hot spots are in red appropriately, and then the other parts are in sort of orange. As you can see, this was in the whole country, where this insurrection against British designs, imperial designs, against British imposition on their policies in the country. It started, however, in the south, and it had a very distinct, at first, Shiite leadership. But Iraqis remember this as Thawrat al-Ashrin, the great revolt from the 1920s. The British, however, remember this as the Shiite revolt. Iraqis remember this as the Iraqi revolt. The British remember this as the Shiite revolt. This was a major problem, and it cost the British about 400 lives to quell down this insurrection. 400 soldiers. Most of them were from India, from the Indian army, but perhaps more significantly for the British at the time, and it was debated in the parliament then, it cost 40 million pounds sterling to quell this down. And Winston Churchill, who was then a Ministry of War, he was, what is happening here? He said we should fight an all-out assault, and he said, like this famous quote, "I'm strongly in favor of using poisonous gas against these uncivilized tribes to create a lively terror." So Saddam Hussein was not the first to use poisonous gas against the Iraqis. The insurrection, 1920, taught the British one lesson. We cannot control this region very well. And if we are to control it, we should do it cheaply, low cost. So they gathered together all their best experts, Middle East experts, in Cairo, as clearly from this picture. And here you have Winston Churchill sitting rather uncomfortably on the camel right here. Here you have Gertrude Bell, the aforementioned Gertrude Bell. Here you have T.E. Lawrence, who was Lawrence of Arabia in the famous movie by David Lean, and other Hogarth and other British area experts. Basically, at the Cairo conference, they decided that the wave of the future, the best way to organize this region was to have indirect rule, to find people that we can rely on, and that these people, we would have a facade of local rule, but behind us there would be benign, benevolent British advisors. But as far as Iraqi was concerned, it was the big question, who should rule and what should be Iraq's borders? Because of the 1920 insurrection, they did not want the Shia to rule. They had lost all sort of respect. So that's a problem because the Shiites are a majority. We cannot directly rule this country as we do in India because that's too expensive. So let's have an indirect rule. And how can we best do this without having too many soldiers on the ground? The newly formed Royal Air Force there proved very efficient tool in terms of governance. Air power. There's a famous quote by a northern Iraqi Kurd who said, "I have feared two things in life. It's God and government from the air." They would fly with airplanes to show who was in power. That was much more cheaper. But they felt that in Iraq it needed to be viable politically, so we need to have a Sunni majority, and we need to have a country that's economically viable, that has oil. So they decided to essentially, after negotiations and some fights with the French, to carve out or design the country in this manner, that what we now know as Iraq, with these borders. If you see here sort of Iraq sort of on the left on the regional map, how it looks there, but also if you compare it to what they had been talking about with France, France lost out what was basically northern Iraq, and the British decided to forge ahead and established a monarchy. Remember, Maude said, we're not going to impose upon you alien institutions. There'd never been a monarchy in Iraq. And the British were very imaginative. What kind of government should we have? Oh, let's have a monarchy. So they imposed a monarchy. They drew the border that is now Iraq. They included the northern Kurdish areas because the Kurds are Sunni, so they thought if we have the Kurds along, that will give us a more sizable Sunni minority, and then the Shia will not be in a strong majority. But who should rule? Luckily for the British, hanging out in Europe, there was a Faisal, King Faisal. He was the son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca. If you remember Lawrence of Arabia, he was the Alec Guinness character. He had been one of the sort of leaders of the Arab revolt. British had sort of promised his family a kingship. He was this sort of out-of-work, unemployed royal. So they said, why don't we just bring in this guy and put him on the throne on the Hashemite Monarchy? So they prepared a plebiscite, they prepared the groundwork, and eventually in August 1921, they bring in a reluctant Faisal who comes from Mecca, put him on the throne of Iraq, and that throne was made the night before from beer cases, Indian beer cases. They put him on the throne. As you can see on the left is Percy Cox. In the background there you see sort of curious onlookers. And as he was finished, he had issued a declaration, I'm now the king of Iraq. The military band, the British military band, didn't really know what to do at this glorious occasion, so they started playing God Save the King, the British national anthem. But this was the Hashemite monarchy, a rule that was definitely beneficial to the British government, something that they trusted, who he could be a pliant soldier for, sort of ruler for them, that he would be served in their best interest. Faisal had never been to Iraq. He didn't know the local dialects. He did not know the local tribes, did not know the local economy, didn't know the local history. He did not know the local sort of struggles and identities. That picture to your right is taken in 1921. The one on the left is taken in 1932, 11 years later. As you can see, he has aged considerably. It is not easy to be a king. It was a very difficult position for him to be found where he found himself in being put there by the British with clear British backing, with no sort of support among the population. So he constantly had to try to prove himself to be Iraqi with sort of foreign backing, which proved extraordinarily difficult. He says, just before he dies, this is a very famous quote, that in 1933, in Iraq, there is still no Iraqi people, but unimaginable masses of human beings devoid of any patriotic ideal, imbued with religious traditions and absurdities, connected by no common tie. Faisal was a foreigner, put on the throne by the British. He was struggling to lead this nation. After 12 years, he was frustrated with how poorly this project had gone. So he says this in expiration, sort of desperation. But indeed, despite this sort of remark by Faisal, there is indeed an Iraqi nation. And Iraqi nationalism has gone through very distinct stages. Just sort of crudely and roughly, I have a very basic chronology. Basically, from 1921 to 1958, it was a top-down process in which the government tried to convince its citizens that we are an Arab nation first and foremost. Our legitimacy and who we are is based on Arab culture and to a certain extent on Islam. Islam, I put it in parentheses because it was not so upfront and center, but part of the legitimacy of the Hashemite monarchy comes from the fact that they were Hashemites, descendants from the Prophet Muhammad, so there was some degree of Islamic legitimacy. But first and foremost, we're an Arab state, and the school curriculum, all the heroes that the children were taught about, all emphasize Arab history from Muhammad forward. Of course, highly problematic to the Kurds, to the Turkmens, and other non-Arab populations of Iraq. Between 1958 to 1968 is a very interesting period in which they sort of move away from the Arab emphasis, partly because there was in Egypt a strong Arab leader, so they wanted to sort of prove their uniqueness by stressing their pre-Islamic identity. We are Iraqis because we used to be Babylonian or Assyrians and Akkadian and so on and so forth. So it was a pre-Islamic identity that did not stress the Arab, so that was a change. Then you have another change in 68 to 79, where you have an Arab secular state with the Ba'athi regime, which didn't really emphasize religion at all, but emphasizes pan-Arabness. Then between 1979 with Saddam Hussein, it was a combination of pre-Islamic and Arab all put together to try to have a catch-all and to have multiple venues of identity. Today, 2003, it's an open question. The state has collapsed, and religion and ethnicities are more prominent than they were before. So what I would like to maintain, that the basis for Iraqi nationalism is not blood, it is not race, it is not religion, it is not language, but a term which I call paradigmatic nationalism. In other words, it's a nationalism based on culture, or a nationalism in which the government has identified certain paradigms or certain themes, certain tropes from history in which we can identify with and sort of compel our constituents, our people, that this is the basis of our identity. It's a cultural nationalism, but still, nevertheless, so that it seeks homogeneity, seeks unity in the Iraqi experience, a paradigmatic national, a cultural nationalism. And Iraqi nationalism, because of the very distinct experience of the last 30 years of basically being a pariah in the international system, being subject to one war or the other, isolation and so on and so forth, that too has also become a major feature and a self-identifying. We are Iraqis because we have experienced sanctions, invasions, and international isolation. Here are some pictures to show from the 80s in particular how some sort of presentations of the mix between sort of modern and the ancient. This is a poster from the Iran-Iraq war where you have the modern Iraqi soldier fighting the bad Persians and the Assyrian soldiers. Together they fight united against Iran. As you can see, they're from the same root, the same trunk, two different branches of the same trunk. So the ancient Assyrian and the modern soldier. This kind of image would not have made sense in the 20s and 30s when they were really more emphasizing the Arab identity. Another picture, also from a similar period. Here you have Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon with Saddam Hussein, providing him with building materials for Saddam Hussein to rebuild the walls of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was a hegemon in the Persian Gulf. Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem. So for Saddam Hussein, Nebuchadnezzar was a very attractive role model. So together, we are rebuilding Iraq anew. He also wanted to portray himself as an Arab leader. Here he is in a traditional Arab guard. Here he's leading the ancient and the modern armies from the Ishtar Gate and the modern city of Baghdad. He was also a wise ruler. Here you have Hammurabi and Saddam Hussein on the same plane. And in the middle, you have the Codex Hammurabi, which is in the Louvre Museum. And you have the Ishtar Gate, which is in the Berlin Museum. This was a very point that the Iraqis were trying to make, that our heritage has been stolen from us, but our just ruler will eventually claim that for us. It's not just top-down political, though that is very omnipresent. It is also representative in the arts, in literature, in poetry. Iraqis did develop a distinct Iraqi voice in their literature and also in their art. I mean, of course, I could pick up random images that suit my thesis, but the Iraqis artists have played and utilized, incorporated ancient Mesopotamian and Islamic legends into their artwork to signify that we are Iraqi artists and not Jordanian, not Egyptian. So they are somehow taking pride or incorporating that ancient history in trying to distill who they are, or as a commentary on today's. Here's one of the most famous murals in Baghdad today by Jawad Salim. This was commissioned in the mid-50s and finally finished in 1961-62. Here you have basically the history of Iraq by this modernist artist who was trained in Europe, where he sort of has the chronology of the Iraqi nation. And he puts in ancient Sumerian and Babylonian and Arab, sort of Islamic motifs to show this path in which the Iraqi nation has traveled through. I always try to put in a soccer reference in my talks. Football. Iraqis therefore have a sense of belonging, a sense of pride in their history, in their poets, in their cooking. They really feel distinct. And even in times of trial and tribulation, like today, they still get united, for example, around their soccer team. When Iraq won the Asian Cup, the whole country went berserk. They all rooted for the Iraqi national team. We are all Iraqis. However, this is sort of the ethnic map of Iraq. Here you have very sort of graphically displayed that Iraq is not a homogeneous country. You may have seen very many maps like this, and it is a very interesting map. It shows you that in the south here, the green color is signified of the Shia Muslims. The dark green are Arabs. This pinkish color, these are Shias who are Kurdish. And then the light green up here are the Turkmens, Shias. They're Shia Kurds and Shia Arabs. The yellow and the light blue here are the Sunnis. These are the light blue in the north here are the Kurds, and the yellow here are the Sunnis. They tend to be congregated in the central and in the north. The red spots up here in the north are the Christian communities, and then there are others. So it is a country that has maybe sort of 2-3 major sort of religious identities. The language map is more clearer and maybe more distinct. The light green color is Arabic, which is about 75% of the population. And the light blue is Kurdish, which is about 20 to 25% of the population. The red parts are the Turkmen who speak a Turkish language, Altaic language. As you might know, Kurdish is an Indo-European language, and Arabic is a Semitic language. So even though they're living there, they're speaking entirely different, belong to entirely different language groups. At the same time, in addition to the linguistic religion, Iraq also has a lot of tribes, tribal affiliations that tend to be based on regions. In the past, many governments have tried to weaken the tribes, not to get them to become too influential, not to allow them to become state within the states, but all states have failed to really weaken the tribes. The British tried to sort of use a divide and conquer with them. Saddam Hussein tried to empower some of them. But tribal affiliations, tribal identities are still strong. They're still going on in Iraq. People still identify in one way or another with their tribe, with their religion, and also with the supra identity, which is Iraq. Just sort of, it all boils down to oil, that the oil, as you may know, is largely in the south, and not just everywhere in the south, in very specific pockets in the south. Here around Basra, here in the southeast, and then around here in the north, in the Kurdish areas, or some contest that, around Kirkuk. So there's oil in Iraq, but it's concentrated. It's not elsewhere, which poses major problems for any plans for the future. But when you look at this map, and you see that there are the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Kurds, and when we observe it like that, it seems therefore that there must be sort of a degree of homogeneity among the Shiites, and that they must therefore be profoundly different from the yellow, the Sunnis, and so on and so forth. However, within each of these categories, there are multiple interpretations, multiple political interpretations of what is desirable, what is just, and what should be the solutions for our future. Shiites in Iraq are relatively recent. They're entirely different from their counterparts in Iran. The Shiites in Iraq are Iraqi nationalists. When the Iran-Iraq war between Iraq and Iran was taking place, Iran is Shia. Iraqi Shiites took up guns and fought the Iranians. They were Iraqi nationalists. So therefore, it might seem therefore rational, and it might seem sort of very Solomonic to, if there is these problems and we have these entities, we have these people, we have these three distinct groups, yes, that we sort of split it up. We have the north, and we have the south, and then we have the center, the center for the Sunnis triangle. Henry Kissinger has said it would be a wiser course to concentrate on the three principal regions. Senator Brownback of Kansas gave a big history lesson in the Senate the other day with maps from the 19th and early 20th century to prove that Iraq, it's more natural to have it three countries. But these regions like this do not exist. When you present it in this way, you assume some sort of regional homogeneity. This is not a prudent solution because it's a top-down imposed solution. Iraqis do not want their country to be split apart. They worry about federalism and what that would mean, and whether that would, and have a federalism based on ethnicities. The Constitution of Iraq assumes that we can have each province have the federal option if they want to. And in April 2008, it will be very exciting to see which Iraqi provinces decide to have some degree of self-governance rather than taking the orders from the center. The Kurds in the north are more excited about this decentralized state and about the federalist ideas for very obvious and clear purposes. But the large majority of Iraqis, and now we actually have opinion polls, do not want federalism, are worried what that would mean, and they worry that the federalist would in fact encourage more sectarian violence, and they were worried what that would mean for the future. In 1920, the British interests were very clear. They really negotiated how to define Iraq in a particular way that really suited their interest. So what are the interests right now? There's chaos, there's anarchy. Perhaps that was part of the plan. But how does the US government intend to define Iraq? 2 days before the military campaigns started in March of 2003, George Bush talked to the Iraqi people through a radio broadcast that was translated into Arabic, and he said, if we must begin a military campaign, it's directed against the lawless men who rule your country, and it's not against you. We will bring you food and medicine. We will tear down the apparatus of terror and help you build a new Iraq that is prosperous and free. In a free Iraq, there will be no more wars of aggression against your neighbors, no more poison factories, no more executions, no more torture chambers, and no more rape rooms. The terror will soon be gone. The day of your liberation is near. Various politicians, such as Joseph Biden, have come up with these plans, but it is, I think, self-defeating, and it is there's a contradiction to believe in the sovereignty of nations and that principle, and say that you have a plan, and then at the same time maintain that you do not want to impose anything on the Iraqi people. The Iraqi people do not want Biden's plan. Key political decisions should not be imposed from the outside. Many presidential candidates, including Hillary Clinton, have a very ethnic approach to Iraqi politics. They assume that the Shia are Shia, and therefore they act as Shia, and they act as a whole. But that is as far from the truth as can be. The Shia are very divided. An ethnic approach, just because we know that there's Sunni, Shia, and Kurds in Iraq, doesn't necessarily mean that is how Iraqis themselves organize themselves or act in that particular way. As the Norwegian historian Reidar Visser asks, should the US be drawing lines on other people's maps? There's also a question, remember the British found Faisal, about who should really rule this country. Several leading US politicians have asked, where's Nelson Mandela? Where's the Nelson Mandela of Iraq? Bush said, well, Nelson Mandela is dead because Saddam Hussein killed all the Nelson Mandelas. But it's a very similar attitude in which the British said that they couldn't find sort of a good leader, a sort of somebody they could trust. Gertrude Bell said, if only we could manage to install a native head of state, then things would be so much easier. But we can't trust any of them. That's why I have to bring in somebody from outside. We want to set up a government agreeable to all. The drawback is that such a government doesn't exist, says Gertrude Bell in 1920. Today, that is very similar. I wish we could find some leader who can lead the Iraqi people similar to Nelson Mandela. And let's go back to King Solomon. Remember the Solomonic decision to split up Iraq. Remember that story from the Bible. 2 mothers, a baby. Solomon, in his wisdom, decides to decide who is the true mother of the child by saying, okay, let's just split up the baby in 2. What happens? The real mother says, no, don't do it. Give it to the other mother. In Iraq today, Iraqis, the true mother of Iraq, do not want the split to be split up. The Americans, the non-mothers of Iraq, do want it to be split up. What is Iraq? Hannah Batatu asked. He wasn't asking a question. He was answering an answer. So he wasn't questioning, I've come to realize, that there is an Iraq. For him, Iraq was the answer. Iraq is, according to Hannah Batatu. Iraq should be defined by Iraqis, for the Iraqis, without external imposition or interference. Jawad Salim's mural. Thank you.